Hello and welcome to a Press Gazette webinar entitled Consent-Driven Advertising, Making Consent and Trust Your Competitive Advantage. So we're presenting this in partnership with OneTrust, and I'm going to be talking to OneTrust's solutions engineer, Kenta Barrett. So what we're going to learn is a little bit about where we are with privacy and advertising. We're going to talk a bit about the digital marketing ecosystem, which publishers are not doing too well out of overall at the moment, and finding out what we can do about that to get a sort of slightly bigger chunk of the pie for publishers. And hopefully at the end of this, you should have a good idea about the importance of having consent, respecting privacy of your audience, how to do it, and how to make a few more quid, hopefully, as publishers. Because when you collect and respect the consent and preference choices of your customers, they reveal more. With that intelligence, you as a publisher can do more. Brilliant. Okay, so welcome, Kenta Barrett from OneTrust. You're a solutions engineer. I'm always impressed with anyone who's got the title engineer in their title. I think it sounds like a proper job. But Kenta, just give us a hello and what you do and what OneTrust is. Thanks.
Yes. So we like to put the word engineer in places because it makes us sound smarter than we often are.
It works.
Yeah, and I engineer solutions. Who doesn't want that? So my role is I work in kind of our pre-sale side, helping to understand where our customers are in their tech stack, what technologies they're using, and how OneTrust as a software can fit within that. So I specialize in our consent and preference management tools. That goes from our CMP, which is the cookie banner, which is what we're probably most going to be talking about today, in terms of capturing consent from users, and especially as publishers, how you're able to utilize that data to deliver targeted ads. And then that goes on to that first party data capture and capturing consent for anything. If someone's providing you personal data, capturing consent around that. So OneTrust sells a whole suite of different privacy softwares, but consent management is kind of our key topic today.
Okay, and the big picture here is that as far as online advertising goes, as far as display advertising goes, it's all underpinned by, or it's very largely underpinned by people's ability to personalize advertising, to show people advertising that's relevant for them, that they're likely to act upon. And our ability to do that by publishers is, well, we'll get into it, but it's governed by what Google will let us do, what privacy regulations will let us do, and I guess what audiences will want as well, and what they expect. Is that fair?
Exactly, and especially over the past 10 years, there's been or maybe longer, there's been a big shift in the way people view their own data. So obviously since GDPR, and then also these big tech changes that are happening, this is all kind of being driven by a consumer desire for, one, yes, we want more personalization, but two, we want to feel safe, and that our privacy is being respected amongst that. And they seem like opposing viewpoints in this market, and how do we reconcile those two kind of opposing viewpoints?
Yeah, and if you get that consent piece wrong, you can really annoy your audience, and you can really kind of undermine everything you're trying to achieve, both subscriptions and advertising as well. So look, listen, this week we on Press Gazette we covered the latest AA stroke walk figures for the UK advertising market. So the good news is that even though it feels a bit recession-y in the UK, overall advertising is predicted to grow 2.6% this year. So the whole pie is going to be up, approaching £36 billion. which is a lot. Online display advertising overall set to go up 6.6%, but publishers are generally going down. So in print and online, I'm talking, and by that I mean national and regional news brands and magazine publishers. Their share of the pie is going down. So it looks like most of the growth is currently going to the tech platforms. And I'm just wondering if you could help set the scene for us a little bit in terms of what's going on with the digital ecosystem at the moment.
Yes. So over the past few years, as third-party cookies are being phased out, so obviously the larger tech players, the Apples and Mozilla Firefox, for instance, they've both kind of made them by default switched off and blocked, and then Google announcing they're going to be doing that. They've pushed the goalpost back a little bit, which is mostly because there isn't a very clear alternative that will maintain kind of the current system while still kind of respecting that kind of customer choice which is happening. So that's been kind of delayed slightly, but over the next year or so it should be phased out. And then part of that is these big CMP changes that Google have announced, aligning that consent management and that consent signaling throughout. So and on top of that, because of all these changes, the fidelity of data, of that third-party data, and being able to identify an individual has dropped by about 60%, according to a Gartner report that was released like 2022. Our ability to identify individuals accurately has dropped because more and more people are rejecting third-party cookies. They're utilizing kind of browsers which are privacy centric, things like this, and also just the quality of the data out there. So then the tech platforms which are able to control that centralized data source, and everybody has to opt into these flows, they can maintain that kind of control. And it feels like the advertisers who are trying to buy these ad spaces, they're spending more and more to get good ads, and publishers have to keep getting less and less of a cut of that because they're so dependent upon that single flow. And just that ad tech framework is in a transitionary period, and often like the big players are able to kind of take the larger share of the profits in that situation.
So hopefully, though, as this settles down next year, hopefully we can rectify this a little bit and rebalance things a little bit. And there's a lot of stuff going on with regulators, government level as well, to try and address all this. So let's dive into that side of things quickly, just so that we can know where we are, because we've heard a lot about Google switching off cookies on Chrome. Chrome's the dominant browser. That's where how most people access the internet. Google's been talking about switching off these publisher cookies for a while now, and when the publisher cookies are switched off, publishers can't identify who their readers are, or it's much harder for them to identify who people are when they're coming to the site on Chrome. So it's harder for them to monetize those people. So where are we now with that Google side of things? That's which is the dominant way, I guess, most people access the internet, and the cookies.
Yeah. So there's been a couple of reasons why they've delayed the actual switching it off. Partly because they want to have some sort of way of replacing that, but also the market itself doesn't want to give up that control directly to the Googles, the Metas, the large social media platforms of the industry, right? They control those gateways, and when we switch off those third-party cookies, they're the ones who will still have that data because they've got their big networks. So to kind of part of kind of delaying that process is around what is the next alternative. So some of the big initiatives around this and what kind of Google have been trying to do is these ways of anonymously identifying people. So rather than being able to target an individual directly, being able to put them into a group, some sort of cohort, and say, okay, we'll do contextually based advertising because we know a few qualities about this person, but not knowing who they are exactly. To go with this comes that first party data strategy on the kind of the marketing side, on the people who are buying ads. They need to understand their customer base more so that they can target cohorts rather than individuals, or targeting individuals who've provided consent specifically. So around that comes this kind of this tech change with the CMPs. How are people capturing consent? How are we signaling consent so that we can maintain this kind of this identifying this individual because they've chosen to be identified, rather than identifying them without them really knowing. And that's that kind of that shift. The main part of that shift, and this is kind of we'll kind of discuss this in a bit with this Google CMP requirements change, where in order to tap into those Google Ads framework, you need to be utilizing one of their certified CMPs, which is utilizing TCF. Hopefully people have heard of the word TCF before, like the Transparency Consent Framework, but this is that online standard kind of framework for a lot of publishers, especially to signal that consent change to all the underlying tech, all the different vendors that they might be utilizing on their webpage. From a regulatory standpoint, TCF was under a bit of fire a couple of years ago. There was a ruling by the Belgian Supervisory Authority that it wasn't compliant with GDPR. And they announced a few changes, shifting over to TCF 2.2, which is going into effect this month, and coinciding with that shift with Google CMP requirements to utilize the CMP which has TCF 2.2 capabilities, which seems like a bit of a shift in sort of, this is now, we need to start utilizing these industry standards of how to signal consent. How do we capture and signal consent to all the different tech frameworks that we are utilizing in kind of an efficient and kind of universal way? There's probably, yeah, go for it, Ben.
Well, I think we'll take a pause and just
there's a lot of information there. I'm sorry, I've got a bit engineering.
Let's digest that. So let's digest the cookies. So the cookies are going to be switched off next year now, at some point, and so that means that as far as Chrome goes, we'll have to use Google's own sort of anonymized system, Google Sandbox. Is that still what they're talking about, or is it something else? I can't remember.
Yes, that's one of the things that they're trying to initiate. So that's, yeah.
And do we, as publishers, do we have to go along with them, or can we sort of take this into our own hands and come up with our own system, our own way of identifying people and serving them with ads and so on?
Exactly. That's kind of one of the big initiatives is, because Google Sandbox has got, once again, it's quite a controlled system within theirs, and also there's a loss of fidelity in that data. You can't identify an individual anymore. So a big shift in that is going, well, as publishers, let us understand this user, have them logging in, having their authentication, and capturing that data ourselves, so that we can deliver those personalized ads. And once again, both of these methods is all around kind of consent capture in certain ways, but having that direct relationship with the end user gives a much clearer, stronger understanding of that person that they've consented into. And it's also much more accurate data. One of the examples that I use is, at the beginning of the pandemic, I bought a monitor to work from home. And then as soon as I bought it, an hour later on unrelated websites, I'm getting ads for that specific monitor. the third party tracking identified me as Kenta was looking at this monitor, he must want to buy it. And I'm actually the worst person in the world to advertise that to, because I've just bought it. I don't need to buy it again. And whoever bought that ad, it's now wasted that money there, because they were unable to synchronize that third party data, which is Kenta's looked at this, with their first party data of Kenta has bought this. So rather than sending me an ad for that one product, they should be sending me ads for related products. And that's kind of the issue with these third-party networks, is you can't control the data, and it's difficult to kind of really connect to all. Whereas when you have that first-party data and a direct relationship with the end customer, as a publisher, I can say this is an identified user, this is the information that they're currently looking at on our website, who wants to buy this ad space? And then those advertisers can go, that now synchronizes with our situation, and they can buy that. It's a much more direct relationship and should have a much stronger impact than kind of going into these third party kind of anonymized cohort based advertising as well. So that's kind of that one of those big shifts now is publishers. How do we jump on this and capture that consent directly?
And I suppose it's preferable, well, it's always preferable to, as a publisher or anyone running a business, to try and be in control of your own destiny.
Exactly.
To not be, completely beholden to what the tech platforms are doing. And I suppose it sounds like this takes your, takes your future into your own hands to a certain extent.
Exactly, and you don't want to just be paying massive premiums into these big data people who control a massive amount of data. And actually, the other benefit of that is we don't want to say no to it completely, because they'll have the capability of capturing data which it's on a scale which a lot of other publishers wouldn't be able to do. But you don't want to be completely beholden and dependent on that, but also complementing it with your own direct relationships. Exactly. Yep. So the kind of that both sides of it.
Okay. And is there anything else we need to know about on that sort of regulation front? So I feel like we've covered the Google, we've touched on IAB, the transparency consent framework. Anything else on the sort of regulation side coming along that we need to just be aware of?
There's a few changes in the TCF 2.2 which I should kind of bring up. There's two major changes within there. One is the way the framework can utilize what's it called, legitimate interest. So the legal basis for some of these kind of that processing of personal data, originally legitimate interest was able to be captured, things like that. But with 2.2, a big part of that Belgian ruling was that you can't use legitimate interest to do profiling, and therefore that targeted advertising. So that's going to be that major shift where those purposes, so the TCF framework has 11 different purposes, very specific about what they're doing with all the different processing activities. Legitimate interest is able to be claimed for things like analytics and kind of performance checks, things like that, but you can't claim legitimate interest anymore for that profiling piece, which kind of falls a bit more in line with what the GDPR was. And as someone who studied it, I was like, this is a little bit dodgy with TCF claiming legitimate interest, but providing the opportunity for people to opt out. It's sort of like, well, that's just an opt-out consent model rather than opt-in, and you're kind of fudging it slightly. So this new version requires explicit consent, and that's going to be quite a big shift away from things. The other change is the wording. How do you actually represent and discuss what these processing purposes are? How do you communicate that to end users? How do you have to things like exposing how many tech vendors are utilizing this specific purpose as legitimate interest. So those are kind of the two main things, and that kind of goes back into that same kind of point that I often talk about is transparency. How do you communicate what you're capturing consent for? And two, consumer choice, them actively being able to provide consent. And that's kind of what that TCF change has become. yeah, that's the other thing that I wanted to point out. As much as this is good for consumers, from a publisher perspective, there is going to be that loss of what previously was captured under a legitimate interest is now going to be requiring consent, and therefore that communication around capturing consent is ever more important. How do you get people to opt in is that big question now.
Okay, well, let's get into the nuts and bolts of it a bit then, Kent. I feel like we're across the sort of legislative and the kind of the frameworks of all this. So if you're a publisher, say you've got newsletters, you've got podcasts, you've got a website, you're doing stuff in video, you're interacting with your consumers in all sorts of different ways, and then quite often you're going to want to sort of, the more you can know about them in terms of who they are, then the more effective you can be in terms of giving them what they want editorially. But I guess also the more effective you're going to be in terms of keeping your commercial partners happy. You're the people who keep the lights on by paying for advertising. So how can publishers go about that? And I guess let's get into a bit of like what OneTrust does, in terms of what you've done with clients. If you can talk about any specific examples as well, that would be great.
So when you're capturing data, personal information, you need to capture consent to utilize that. That's the point. And what we've noticed, and we did studies with like the DMA, so they're talking about data and how data is being used, and they go directly into various publishers and ad frameworks to figure out how data is being utilized. They do a lot of statistical analysis and lobbying around that. And then also the Adobe Trust Report, which kind of did a study on trust in the market and with consumers, is if you're creating an open and transparent relationship with the customer, talk about this is why we're capturing data and this is the benefit you get from it, you then deliver that benefit through that personalization, through more relevant ads. People are willing to give data. They want to give data because they can see the benefit of it, and that they can see that they can trust you. You've got all of your privacy policies in order. You've got clear methods for their users to modify their consent. They're not trying to be tricked into providing consent, but they can see, oh, I've got a free choice. That relationship of trust means more data means more value means more trust. It's this virtuous cycle of creating relationship with consumers. What OneTrust provides is trying to give you the tools which allow you to enable that process, whether it's honoring those customer choices immediately and pushing it downstream, whether it's creating those UI flows which enable a customer to modify their consent. That's what kind of OneTrust provides. And I can't kind of emphasize the ability of what's a preference center enough in creating that kind of trust. So a preference center is basically a place where a user can come in and modify their consent, modify their preferences. And whether that's on the cookie banner, where being able to reload a clear space where they can load up and go, actually, I can modify that consent. I'm not just saying accept all when I first join, log onto the site, and therefore I can't opt out ever again. So I'd never want to provide that in the first place, because if I can't opt out, that's really scary. So the people will always start pressing reject all. But if it's very clear, oh, you can always modify your choices whenever you want, here it is, people are very willing to go, okay, then I can trust that. I'm much more likely to just provide that because I know I can withdraw it whenever I need. There's a really interesting example from kind of data privacy professionals who are working kind of globally, and just seeing the number of data subject access requests, right? Like where they want to exercise their rights, they want their right to be forgotten within Europe versus within America. Obviously, America's kind of culturally got a little bit of a litigious culture. They kind of like to sue people. That's it. It's a stereotype, but there's
It's
obviously some evidence around that.
it's fair. I think they've got more lawyers
Yeah,
per head of population than any other country in the world. There must be
exactly.
something.
People like to do that, but part of it comes from the fact that they often don't know what's going on. When they created the DSAR forms in Europe as a legal requirement, people don't exercise it, right? Because they go, okay, yeah, I can see that I can. They'll do it if they need to. But then it was something we were at an event and the person was saying they get 60, 70 times more requests per person in the US than in Europe. Partly culturally, but partly because they don't know. They don't have the same laws to protect them. So they want to just do that. I was at an event yesterday, and one of the customers was saying they get about 10% of all their DSAR requests are from people who they don't have any data from. They're just people jumping in saying, I don't want, because there's a cultural shift out there because they're starting to get these privacy rights coming in the US, which they haven't had before. And now they want to exercise that. Within Europe, because we've got a bit more of established one, people are a bit more relaxed around it. And it's, yeah.
So it's good to be sort of open with people, just very transparent about what you're trying to do, and I guess keep it simple as well. I feel like a lot of the time you feel, as a consumer, you feel like you're being hoodwinked because you're signing up to something you've not got time to read. You don't really understand, but you just think, well, whatever. Let's just get through the moment. So yeah. So what does this look like? Is it like a pop up? Is it a widget? And if I'm coming onto Press Gazette, I've got the OneTrust pop up there. What is this? How long does it take? And is that something which then kind of follows me around all the different platforms of Press Gazette that I would go on?
Yeah, and this is where that user experience behind that comes into play. Kind of going, what is the best way to communicate that? When do they need to see this? A lot of people believe it blocks and it kind of ruins the user experience to kind of have that cookie banner jumping in straight away. And there's two sides to this. One, you need to present it when you need to present it. And maybe that's right at the beginning because you want to maximize that ad revenue. Maybe it's later on. But at the same time, it's just saying, oh, we use cookies. The first thing we say when you come into our domain, going, okay, here is a cookie banner, please exercise your choices, we want to respect you, is actually a pretty positive way to start off that experience. And then being able to honor that choice, so you don't have to keep annoying them and sending that same banner every time they go to a new subdomain or a new area. Like maybe it's a new website, but it's still part of that same Press Gazette world. Being able to honor that choice accordingly. It creates a much nicer user experience, but it's always available somewhere in the footer, or it's always available as a little float. In OneTrust, we have a little floating green cookie button on our site to exercise those choices. And however you want to present that experience is down to you. And we want to avoid what like you're saying, the dark patterns, that way of tricking someone into giving consent, where every time they visit, you send the banner up because they've declined it. And as soon as they accept, you never show them the banner again. And then it's hidden deep within the cookie policy. It makes people, that's something icky about this. I don't trust it.
No, I don't. And you're talking about cookies still. So forgive me if I'm not keeping up. But will we still be talking about cookies like next year when
always
we'll always be talking about them?
I mean, there's two sides. One, we use the word cookie to represent quite a few different sets of technologies, because trackers, beacons, pixels, but cookies sounds the nicest. Everyone actually quite likes a physical, real cookie. So website cookies, we like to kind of cross them over a little bit. But cookies aren't going to go away. It's an incredibly useful piece of technology and very basic. It's just a small text file which we put into the browser and helps to kind of honor that user's session. It's the third-party persistent cookies which track you across websites, which is going to be going away. But the cookie itself still kind of, we want to put this cookie here just so we can track you throughout our site, just to make sure that the classic one is the basket when you're shopping online. The cookie will hold your basket for you. And that's just a very simple, easy way of implementing that piece of technology for user experience.
So that's always going to be a thing, and as you say, the internet as we know it just wouldn't really work without them. Okay, well look, we've got, I think, probably about another 5 or so minutes. If anyone's got any questions, please write them into the chat, and I'll read out any questions. So, I mean, the last couple of things I was going to touch on. So, key benefits really, and I guess there's two of taking this approach. Marketing. So, what the benefits for me as a publisher in selling advertising, selling marketing solutions, of having this very open consent approach, and number 2, what are the benefits in terms of my ability to attract and retain subscribers? Because obviously, we don't have those on Press Gazette yet, but maybe one day in the future. But many publishers, that's a very, very important revenue stream now, isn't it? It's the online subscriptions.
So, one, having a direct relationship with the customer, you've got more accurate data, and you future-proof that data. Of all the legal basis to process personal information, consent is the most legitimized. Everything else can be challenged in some way, but if a user has provided their consent, they can't challenge it. They can remove their consent, but if they provide a consent, they wouldn't challenge it by definition of consent. It's incredibly powerful piece, as opposed to utilizing legitimate interest and other forms of processing that data. You're at risk of legal action, legislation changes, which will remove the ability to utilize that data, and suddenly it's lost. That direct relationship, it future-proofs it, it's more accurate, it's more direct, and you get the data that you need to get rather than relying on a third party. You then have that control to go into partnerships, that second party data, saying, oh, this is a friend of ours, we think you'd really like their content as well. We're not competing with them, this is another publisher, this is another source, this is a friend of ours. Would you like us to share? Because you can get some really cool catered content for you. Those processes isn't possible in the third party data. It's something that you can rely on and create those partnerships and create that world within your communities, which delivers value to the customer, delivers value to those end readers and viewers. So there's kind of those key benefits there. And then from the tech side of things, try to smooth out that process, rather than we still have people manually uploading email addresses into the social media platforms. When that automated process exists, it can be very smooth, and then also being able to honor consent immediately through those tech changes becomes incredibly useful for that user experience as well.
Okay, I've got one question here. So question is, are there any emerging trends or technologies or innovations in consent-driven advertising that we should be aware of? So anything new coming in that we maybe haven't touched on, but we need to be aware of coming down the tracks?
One of the obvious trends everyone always talks about is generative AI, things like that.
Generative AI. How can we have done a media webinar in 2023 without talking about generative AI?
I know, it's mad. It's mad. And partly because it can seem like a little bit of a distraction. It's nice, new and shiny, and probably the actual benefits of it we're not going to know about for another few years. But I was at a marketing event, they're talking about this, the ability for like drafting and like rapidly allowing creativity in the drafting phase is really powerful. But the way consent works with building those generative AI models is very interesting. If a user withdraws their consent from that database, which you've trained your AI model on, how do you then knock it on into removing those data points from the model itself? It's honoring consent through that process, and also consenting to having an AI with your in those user experiences. If are they talking to a chatbot, or is AI being used for analysis? There's all those legal requirements around that which are coming out. So being aware of that on the horizon, but knowing that consent and those data models, there is quite a clear relationship there. What data can we use for creating these generative AI models? But also don't get too distracted by it. It's not quite there yet. There's some really cool stuff out there. Like, look into it, but be aware of the risk reward around this. Do we have the correct consent to do this? Do we have the correct safeguards to protect us around this? So that's one thing. The other side, which I thought was really interesting, I love the word mad tech. That coming together of marketing and advertising technologies, that martech, ad tech, mad tech, and that ability for advertisers, especially wanting to cater to that contextual audience, rather than targeting Kenta Barrett specifically, targeting men in their 30s who like video games and technology, and finding me that way. So as a publisher, how am I signaling this is what my content's about? This is the audience that's coming towards me. That's why this ad space is going to be valuable to you. And I can name drop a few nerdy brands which I like there, but I'll try not to. And that's why it's valuable. So the tech around that hasn't fully been established, but at the same time, it has been, like, just tagging relevant relevant tags on your content to pull that ad revenue in. So those are conversations which are happening, I believe.
Okay. Well, I'm glad we touched on generative AI. But as you say, can become a bit of a distraction, and then probably the here and now nuts and bolts is that the cookies are being turned off on Chrome. Privacy legislation's coming. It's in force. There's a lot of good reasons why we need to get grips as publishers on this area of who's on our site, and how we can ethically and practically kind of capture that information. And even if all this kind of the Google stuff and the privacy stuff wasn't going on, it would still be a good thing to do, because it makes us more able to hold on to subscribers, more able to have good commercial relationships with advertisers. So look, thanks for all that, Kenta. I'm going to ask you, we've covered a lot of ground, a lot to think about. What if you're a publisher looking at this area, kind of a top level view, what's your key take home for them about if they're looking at their ad revenue going down a bit at the moment, they're a bit worried about it, they'd like it to go up again, and they're broadly aware that they need to do something about this consent and privacy piece. What's your big take home for them, if you could boil it down a bit?
Make sure your CMP has the capabilities to send the message you want to send, whether that's communicating effectively the benefits the customer will get from consenting to tracking, or whether that's being able to technically signal that consent into your tech platform. All right, so a CMP which is capable of both of those. Obviously, I'm biased because I am from OneTrust, and that's what our product does. There are others out there. Check those Google CMP requirements. And that's those two sides. What's the user journey with providing and managing their consent, and what's the tech stack that's going to make it as smooth as possible for you, so you can focus on what marketers do best and what publishers do best, is creating good, strong content, and you don't have to be too worried about the tech side of things. Okay. That's number one.
So make sure your consent management platform is giving the right message out to people. And probably if you look at that message and you don't really understand it or follow it yourself, then that's probably a good sign that it needs tweaking. It needs simplifying.
Yeah, exactly. And the other thought that I had like quite recently was the idea of paying for no advertising or paying for just basic so you not going to get tracked. People should be paying for targeted advertising. It makes sense. That's a better user experience. But why are we kind of on some level, it's just like, let's show that benefit. You can less irrelevant ads and better ads. People should want targeted advertising. The danger is people don't trust it. So how do we help people to understand this is for their benefit? And that's that communication side.
Okay,
Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you, Kenta. Thanks very much for joining us.
Very welcome.
So you've been listening to a Press Gazette webinar in association with OneTrust. Thanks very much for watching or listening, and this will be available to view on demand. So watch out for a link if you signed up. Or if you're joining us on demand, even great. But please, please feel free to share that link and with colleagues if they find it interesting. So thanks very much. Thanks very much for watching.
Thank you very much.